Welcome back to IDRA's Classnote podcast. My name is Aurelio Montemayor. I'm the Family Engagement Coordinator, and I'm joined by Morgan Craven, who's IDRA's National Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Community Engagement. In schools across this country, especially for Black, Latino, and low-income students, discipline is too often meant exclusion, humiliation, and physical punishment. And yet, we know something different is possible. We've seen it.
Today, we're asking, how do we create schools that are orderly and welcoming and affirming, where students are held responsible and treated with dignity? The real goal isn't just to get students to behave, it's to help them become, and for teachers to see and support the value and development of every child.
So, what are 5 things we should know about corporal punishment?
Yes. So I think that a lot of people don't know that we still have corporal punishment in schools in the United States, and we do. I think that's really important for people to understand. There are 20 states that still allow for corporal punishment to happen to children in schools. And generally, corporal punishment is defined as paddling, spanking, or another form of physical punishment that's imposed on a child for discipline purposes. Here in Texas, where we live, for example, the law also sort of lays out the types of physical punishment. So a child in a Texas school that has corporal punishment can be spanked, slapped, paddled, hit, or have other forms of physical violence used against them for so-called discipline purposes. Um, the last really robust year of national data, and robust is relative, but in the 2017-2018 school year, we know that nearly 70,000 students, some of them who were as young as preschool age, so that's 3 and 4 years old, were paddled, spanked, or hit in their schools. And these are schools across the country. Some of these kids were hit more than once. And we also know that many of these kids, groups of children, were disproportionately hit. So we know that kids with disabilities make up about 13% of the total K-12 school population in the United States, but we're nearly 17% of students who were hit. We know that Black children make up about 15% of the student population in K-12 schools across the country, but we're more than 37% of children hit. So there are very extreme disparities for certain groups of students when it comes to corporal punishment in schools. The last thing I'll say that we know is that most of these incidents of hitting happen in the southern United States. So the state with the highest number of students hit was Mississippi. Texas was second. Then we have Alabama, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Georgia. So this is a real problem that is pretty concentrated in southern states. And we know that the students that are experiencing corporal punishment, both directly because they have been hit, but also the students that are witnessing their peers being punished in this way are really suffering. So we know that hitting has a negative impact on students' attendance, their academic achievement, their ability to form strong social bonds with their peers and their teachers, and even, negative consequences later in life. And it's certainly not good for school climates where we know we need to be investing in children, in teachers, in the adults, in the school community, rather than punishing them through these really extreme and barbaric forms of discipline.
And it may produce compliance, but there's no real learning, no behavior change. It causes negative academic and mental health outcomes. So for many reasons, it isn't good. And we
That's
also
very
know
true.
there's positive alternatives.
Yes.
Okay, so what does respect for authority look like when it's built through relationships and fairness, not fear?
It's fear is an interesting word to use, and I'm glad that you used it. We have heard from including some policymakers who are supportive of corporal punishment that what they believe needs to happen for children to do what we expect them to do in the classroom is that they need to feel fear. So they need to be afraid of the adults in their classrooms. And that's really the opposite of what you want to see when you're thinking about positive, strong relationships, which are really the root of learning. They are key to kids wanting to come to school and show up and be excited about school. They're the key to school safety. And so what we want to do is have systems in place that really encourage strong relationships where people understand what's going on with the young people in the school. They're connected to them, they know their families, and they have those strong relationships rather than a system that's built on fear, which inevitably will lead to kids not trusting the adults in their lives, not telling them when something is going on, being afraid to share if something is happening with their peers. And so if we rely on fear, we're really destabilizing school environments rather than investing in what we know works to keep kids safe. Has that been your experience both as a teacher yourself, Aurelio, and your many years at IDRA, sort of thinking about what's best for children and families?
One thing I learned on is that listening to the student is very important. Uh, that authority is strengthened, not weakened, when they feel heard, when there's mutual respect, not just one way obedience, but also cultural responsiveness. When students notice, for example, that certain groups of students are punished and others are not, uh, it not only goes against culture, it is unjust, and they see that. And so, even with students that aren't punished, it's difficult to build trust over time because of how the school acts in these matters.
Yeah, I think about that a lot, what it must be to be a child in a classroom and to see a peer punished. And what that means for your connection, even if you aren't the one directly being punished, but what that means for your connection to the learning environment and to the adults that are doing the punishment, and ultimately what it means to kids' connection to the kids who are being punished. And when we think about corporal punishment and really any other form of discipline, we know the kids that are disproportionately punished. As we mentioned at the beginning, it's Black students, Black boys and Black girls. It's children with disabilities. It's LGBTQ plus kids. And so when those are the kids that everyone else sees are the ones that are targeted, and the adults are saying, these are the kids that we exclude. These are the kids that we hit disproportionately. These are the kids that are labeled as bad. I think it really does a lot to for put into students' brains an opinion about other kids that really gets in the way of the relationship building and diverse relationship building that we want to see in schools.
As a classroom teacher, I realize teaching is a huge responsibility. It is not easy. It requires a lot of attention and time. And right now, the way schools are being attacked, teachers feel the pressure. But I also know that when we have these conversations, a teacher will say, well, we need stronger consequences. Well, addressing the root causes uh, is a strong consequence because you look on behavior as communication. You know, you look at unmet needs, academic struggle, trauma, instability, rather a need for harsher punishment. That does not get to the root cause. Okay, you need an environment that has different kinds of interventions, layered interventions that you do before things escalate. It's not just access to counselors and mental health supports, but the teachers, as classroom teachers, need to be given the tools to how do you create the environment so that when there is something, there's a disturbance, how do you deal with it in such a way so that the classroom continues, but you don't have to take excessive measures because that does not get at the root cause.
I agree. And I also think it's important for teachers to get the tools to understand kind of what they're bringing into the classroom that influences how they're seeing student behavior. So, what we see in a lot of discipline data is that students of color, particularly Black students, students with disability, are punished more harshly for the same behaviors that are exhibited by their peers. And so it is a matter of saying, in some cases, it's a matter of saying, what does that student need? Is there something going on in their lives that's leading to this particular behavior? How can we help address the root cause? But in some cases, it's saying, teachers are looking at certain children differently than they're looking at others. And how do we equip them with the tools to understand that they are doing that? And to instead, and I know I'm speaking your love language here, really take, asset-based approaches to teaching and see the value of every single student in their classroom, and really recognize how to pour something positive into children, rather than identifying what could be a really age-appropriate behavior as something worth punishing.
Morgan, sometimes when we use the phrase restorative practices instead of exclusion, there's an adult frustration about that. And what we're saying, these are better tools. They ensure accountability, but also preserve the dignity and connection to learning. Um, when when we exclude the students from the learning environment, uh, there's a disconnection. There's no remediation. You remove them from the environment. Accountability should happen while maintaining access to instruction in some way. That has to continue. But
I
also
totally.
that reflection is structured into the institution. And this might be difficult for some administrators to see, but the environment that you create of communication, how you work with staff, how staff is given these kinds of tools, create the environment where instead of telling a kid you're the problem, you said, okay, you made a mistake. Let's work around that. So you can, but you cannot protect that dignity and growth if the environment has not been already informed and adapted to that administrators, counselors, and teachers. So that,
I totally agree. And I
yeah.
would add, and I'm going to turn this into a question for you. Obviously, families are a big part of that. So, what do you think in your, many years of experience engaging with families and helping them to engage in policy and practice in their schools? What role do you think families have to play in shaping discipline policies and practices that reflect cultural values and reflect a commitment to student well-being and equity?
Well, one of the challenges I keep facing in our work in community engagement is that I'm dealing with talking to connecting with families that are excluded. They're not considered part. They don't sit on committees. They're not the PTA officers. And yet, I think the families, the working families, the regular families that maybe don't even come to the meetings are the ones you have to bring in to shape the discipline, because a conversation that includes families and students to talking about it is becomes an environment familial in the best sense of that the school becomes that community. Because remember, community knowledge, how many years of experience does a mother who's raising five kids have that we need from her? You know, she's gotten her PhD from life, and so schools don't see that in that way. And in fact, some of the parents that I work with in South Texas, I encourage them to join the PTA. And a lady goes in and they tell her, "Oh, we're glad you're here so you can help sell tamales so we can raise money." In other words, it's almost like a cheap labor pool, and that's not the engagement we need. Families engaged, talking about critical issues like behavior. How do we have an environment that's safe for all the kids, that kids are learning? And when one child is somehow disruptive, what do we do so that the punishment doesn't make it worse, doesn't exclude the student, but and yet teaching continue. And the other part about it is families have certain cultures and certain patterns that are very useful for us to understand and integrate into the school, because a lot of times it might be a culture clash or a difference of culture of the campus that makes the students somehow rebel or not fit in. And also understanding that students don't speak from a dictionary or from a literary book. The language of students is not necessarily an insult.
Yeah, that's really important. I also think like culture and community are such important and interesting aspects of the corporal punishment conversation. I think a lot of people rely on culture and community as an excuse to continue hitting children in schools. We hear a lot, well, I was hit and I turned out fine, or this is what our community does. And I think part of the work that we do is really push and challenge that. One, I don't think that's true in a lot of communities. I don't think that um, they would want, their children to be hit in schools and are sort of that label is put on them unfairly. But I also think it's an opportunity to be really clear about the harms of corporal punishment in school and all of the tools that exist out there to move to something that is more positive, more rooted in student dignity, that encourages safe and supportive and well-managed classrooms. So I think that that's one of our one of the challenges and opportunities we have in the work is to really reframe how we think about students and how they should be treated. And I think a lot of communities are on board and maybe get this sort of unfair label that harsh discipline is what they would want.
And as we come close to the end of our conversation, corporal punishment sometimes may produce a moment of silence, but it doesn't produce understanding. It doesn't produce responsibility or trust.
Mm-hmm.
And too often it leaves lasting harm, especially for students who are already carrying the weight of inequity. So it's not whether schools need discipline, of course they do. What kind? And do we want discipline that helps connect and transform, or that just excludes or punishes?
Well said. Thank you for this today. What an important start to a conversation about corporal punishment, discipline, and I think the most important thing, how do we invest in students and teachers and create the schools that are safe and welcoming and affirming that we want for all young people?
Thank you.
Thank you.